Hello on a blustery evening, yet again from Dublin City in Ireland. It's Mark Manning here with a book at bedtime. Not sure what the viewership is like. Well, I kind of am. It's pretty bad. But if I've got one or two of you there, that's all right. And by the way, I enter this with my eyes open. This is not a sprint, it's a marathon. If I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. Why am I reading this book? The book, of course, you might have seen, Ideas Have Legs. This is an original copy dating from 1945, the year of the end of the war. Some of the stuff in it is relevant to today. You know, big forces and big ways of thinking clashing against each other. You know, different cultures. So you got communism and Nazism here. The protagonist, a guy called Peter Howard, this is a real story, has a moral conscience, or has a conscience. A social conscience is the word I'm looking for. But as he climbs the ladder of success in London town in the interwar years, he's becoming rather fond of the success, the accolades that he's getting, both as a political writer and as a sports person, as we'll see shortly. So he is kind of aware probably what's going on in Germany, and yet he's kind of acquiescing within society, probably against his better judgment. Am I lecturing you? I don't mean to. So, what will I wear tonight? That one. Dis or dis, as we say in Ireland. But I'll try these ones. So our friend is going to talk to us about football now and his prowess, or rugby to be precise. And he plays Ireland in it. And we were even brilliant back in the 1930s. Last night we beat the world champion South Africa. So not a lot has changed in that respect. He'll also mention bobsleighing in Cortina in Italy, in fascist Italy. I happen to have skied in my time in Cortina. It is a beautiful place. And a bobsleigh, which was one of the most terrifying things in my life. But I think that was in Innsbruck when I was young. Oh yeah, not the age I am today. Are we sitting comfortably? Remember, if you want to buy me a cup of coffee, my PayPal is down below in the description. And if you do, I'll ring my ding-a-ling for you and give you acknowledgement. Not sure what the lighting is like here tonight, boys and girls. God knows I've got a lot of it, but I don't know. It's probably a bit subdued, it should be low anyway, because here's our book at bedtime. Chapter 4. I think there's only about 19 or 20 to go. Football boots and spikes. Let's get this mic in close. My grandfather was an unexpected fellow. He was both bearded and beloved. His name was Ebenezer. When he was over 80, I sought his advice on a certain course of action. Already I had decided to take that course, whatever advice my grandfather offered. But I hoped the old gentleman would be pleased and flattered at my inquiry. The following conversation took place between us on the platform of Bexhill West Station as I waited for his train. Myself. Grandfather, there's something I want your advice about. Grandfather, fiercely. Well, Peter, you shall have my advice, but you won't pay attention to it. Myself, stung by the truth of this observation. You see, I am wondering whether I should... Grandfather, don't bother to tell me about it. I don't want to hear it. My advice to you... Sorry, he's gone a bit cockney, hasn't he? He's supposed to be upper tough. My advice to you, and all young men, is don't do it. Then they usually do it, and afterwards they are sorry. No more would my grandfather Ebenezer say. He was climbing, puffing into the train. The train climbed, puffing out of the station. I was left punctured on the platform. I add, in order to confirm the elderdom and betterdom of my grandfather, that I did do it and was sorry afterwards. But the advice, don't do it, is one ever offered by age to youth and ever repugnant to it. The simple words, don't do it, have incited young people to more acts of defiance and folly than any other. 3 in the language. My left leg was responsible for a piece of advice which altered my course. My left leg is lame. I was born with it that way. Since birth it has been little thicker than my wrist, and I have never been able to point my toe. At the age of 7, I sprained this leg, playing football with my friends. The doctor who examined the sprain said to me, "Well, cricket is a better game for you. Don't play football. You stick to cricket. There's a good boy." He went away. By the way, I narrate for a living on and off and voiceovers and stuff. Some people get annoyed, when I change character, but I don't care. Right, it's more fun for me because this gets boring sometimes. Okay, no more breaking the wall, right? It was at that moment, I think, that the desire to be a footballer sprang to life inside me. As my father and Arthur, my uncle, had both been rugby footballers, rugby was the game for me. I used as a boy to spend my shilling and sway with the Macintoshed multitude on the mound at Twickenham. Out on the green before us the team would weave the pattern of the game, miniatured by distance, uncanny in precision and skill, resilient against injury, emblems of power and poise and purpose. And there was the exhilaration and rough humour and warmth of a British crowd, the stamping of feet and the shouts and shuffling as the terraces began to fill, the man with a megaphone who yelled orders and packed us patiently into position while we chaffed and cheered him in turn, the oranges and sandwiches, the rattles and whistles and songs, bagpipes for the Scottish match, the green hats and streamers for Ireland, and for the Welsh, Land of My Fathers, sung by the 70,000 so you caught your breath and your eyes filled with tears. A moment later, the annual avalanche of laughter as a little Welshman ducked out on the field and shinned up to tie a leak on the crossbar, while, imperturbable and massive, the blue-coated police waited for his descent with outstretched arms below. The deafening roar of welcome as each team trotted onto the field, the sway and groan of the multitude as some fine piece of play ended just short of the line. Oh, the comradeship and passion and fun of a British crowd, the heart and blood of our nation. The rush and uproar as the final whistle blew, and suddenly everyone, players and spectators, silent and still, every hat off as the band crashed out the strains of God Save the King. Then the journey home in tube and bus, standing talking with men you never saw before or since, old friends for the afternoon, united by the love of a national sport. You understand Britain and love Britain when you love and understand a British crowd. Kings, governors, princes, politicians. Move on escorted and unafraid through the midst of our multitude. Oh, those crowds at Twickenham in the days of my childhood. It was there that first my country touched and held my heart. There was nothing at that time which I so much desired to be as a rugby international. The distance and difficulty of the vision added to its enchantment. One autumn afternoon years later, I went to watch the Greyhounds, the Oxford University second 15 perform. One of the 15 fell ill. By a string of chances, I was the only available and suitable player to fill the hole. In that match my opponents were not where I was, while where I ran the ball inevitably followed. Next day, I was picked to play for Oxford University. It seemed at the time the most colossal event of life. I feel paternal now as I look back across the years which divide me from that coltish, eager young fellow who believed the full radiance and glory of creative life could be experienced by those who wore the red rose of England at Twickenham. So, I took my first stride into that world of highly organised sport, which meant so much to Britain in the interwar years. Many believed that the spirit of Britain was at its best on the playing field, and there was something to be said for that viewpoint. Many of the pilots who saved civilization in the skies after Dunkirk owed part of their quality to the lessons learned on cricket fields and football grounds from their childhood upward. Yet what was this spirit of sport, this ideal of decent conduct, adequate to build a new world? Can I start again? Yet was this spirit of sport, this ideal of decent conduct, adequate to build a new world? Did it so drug some folk with a sense of our decency that it blinded us to a sense of our ineffectiveness? It took me 2 years to get my first international cap. 2 years in which I ate football, drank it, dreamed it, lived it, and was not far off dying at it more than once. Then an international match against Ireland at Dublin set me thinking. I remember landing in Ireland for that game, after a night crossing of the Irish Sea, with the cameramen and the reporters to meet and greet us. The wonder of achievement was still fresh upon me. In the Shelburne Hotel, Dublin, I was conscious of the looks which followed each member of the team, and walked through the lounge several times in order to enjoy them. We drove out to the ground for the match next day. I had lunched off hot steak and cold milk. I had the theory that I played better after this diet of contrasts. When I opened my bag at the ground, with the hum and moan and gabble of the multitude bursting through the window, a frightening but intoxicating sound, I discovered that I had failed to bring my puttees from England. I was determined that the England selectors should never notice on the field how thin my left leg really was, in case they took fright and dropped me from the side. So I used to roll 2 puttees around it, mould them into the shape of a sound leg, and pull my stocking over them. Now the puttees were gone. The game was due to begin in 5 minutes. I ran into the wash place. I grabbed a towel from the rail, rammed it somehow around my leg, and tied my stocking over it. Off we ran onto the field. The air was blurred with the uproar of the Dublin crowd, commingled with the shouts of the boatloads of English supporters who had made the night crossing to watch the game. The whistle blew. I can see that ball now, silhouetted like a yellow lemon against the grey Dublin skies, dropping and twisting towards us. I caught it and kicked it to touch as 3 Irishmen sprang on top of me and knocked the breath out of my bones against the grass. It was a wearing, tearing, worrying, scurrying game. Once breaking from the scrum, I caught the ball inside our own 25 line and ran up the field. 3 times Irishmen tried to tackle me. 3 times I ran on after a stumble and stagger. Finally, the full-back crashed me down only a few lines from the Irish line. It was during the last 20 yards of the run, which sticks in my mind because it was far the longest distance I was ever allowed to carry the ball in a first-class game, that I sensed rather than saw something white snapping or worrying at my heels as I moved. I thought it might be a terrier dog escaped from the crowd. As the full back knocked me over, I perceived the shriller sound of merriment, mixed with the deep baying of the multitude's applause. Then I noticed that the towel, with which so urgently I had padded my leg, was trickling behind me. I snatched it off, pretending to laugh. But I felt bitterness within me. 40,000 people, all laughing at me. We lost the match by a single point. It was a game we should have won. There was a certain gloom and despondency in our midst that evening. Next day the newspapers with their accounts of the match arrived. I grabbed them, and I quickly saw that while the play of the England team as a whole was in a measure criticised, my own part of the performance was upheld for commendation. The word Howard was repeated many times in those newspapers. From that moment, any regret at the loss of the match disappeared from my heart. Other folk on the side stayed glum. I pretended to stay glum, yet inwardly I glowed. This was the first time in which I clearly recognised a fact which remained true throughout my football days. And here it is. I always would rather to be the star on a losing side than blush unseen on a winning team. I was concerned more with my own glory than with the fate of my side. I concealed this successfully from many people. Sometimes I even concealed it from myself. Indeed, at rugger dinners, I constantly made speeches on the themes of team spirit and the game's the thing, and meant it while I said it. But from the day after that Dublin match, I knew deep down in my heart that my own success and fame were the things I really hunted on the rugger field. And these same motives were woven into the pattern and fabric of my life in Fleet Street and elsewhere. I was part of a generation brought up to believe that personal success was the chief duty of the individual. We never saw that 40 million individuals seeking personal success before anything else were bound in the end to lead us to a national catastrophe. Between the wars, many thought international sport would do much to bring the nations together. They believed that the young people of the world, meeting in the healthier and saner atmosphere of green fields, tennis courts and athletic tracks, would do more to promote international understanding than the older boys who sat around conference tables and spoke to each other in the dry language of diplomacy or the musty terms of negotiation. But was it so? Was international sport an ointment or an irritant? Somebody once remarked that the more he studied men, the more he loved his dog. Our naive belief that if only we could see more of other nations, everything would be all right, was typical of the ineffective idealism and goodwill of my generation. We thought we could get a new world on the cheap. We never saw that a new world will only be born by change, not chance. I was asked to be one of the team of 4 to represent Great Britain in the World's International Bobsleigh Championships, held at Cortina in January 1939. Bobbing is exciting and dangerous. You race on an ice track from the top of a mountain to the bottom, rounding hairpin bends of ice, travelling walls 70 or 80 feet high, at 90 miles an hour, almost upside down at times, and held to the bob by centrifugal force. Much depends on the skill and teamwork of the crew. Every skid takes time off the run, and the race is decided in fifths and tenths of seconds. A 2-second lead is almost impossible to overtake in a bob championship. You wear boots with 2-inch spikes to grip the ice as you push off. Also, crash helmets, knee and elbow pads of leather to protect you from falls. But if the bob leaves the track, these things are not much use to you. You may hit a tree, or, worse still, the bob may land on top of you. It is all steel and weighs over a quarter of a ton. Other men are killed or sustain severe injuries from bobbing and the Cresta run. Often men. The teams for the World Championship assembled at Cortina. It was an immense occasion for the Italians. The eyes of all the sporting world were upon them, and they made the most of it. Countess Chiano, then in the heyday of her power and glory, represented her father, Mussolini, throughout the 4 days of the races, and handed out pots at the end. There were fanfares, flags, and all the pomp and ceremony of a fascist fiesta. Teams came from most countries in Europe to compete: Romania, Belgium, France, Switzerland, Italy, and many more. There was a strong and fine team from the United States of America under the captaincy of John Heaton. The Germans entered 4 teams, most of them officers from Goering's Luftwaffe. They had been told to win the World Championship at all costs, on the grounds that the prestige of the Reich would be boosted by victory. They set about this task with silent, sustained efficiency. They kept to themselves, spoke as little as possible in case they inadvertently gave away any secrets, and mounted a permanent guard on their racing bobs, fearing the rest of us might tamper with them. This World Championship, held in the very year in which we broke out, offered a fine chance for international sport to prove its healing influence. There were Germans and Italians, French, British and Americans, as well as most of the Balkan countries. We might have hoped for a period of goodwill and friendliness in which the young men of these different nations set aside the bitterness of their rulers and united in friendship for a few days with a common love of sport. I hoped it, but it was not to be. Instead, a warlike feeling developed, which would have been comical had it not been so hostile and tense. The whole championship resolved itself into the question not of who would win, but of whether we should beat the Germans or the Germans beat us. The American team were our strong allies. The Italians, on the other hand, cheered the Germans loudly from the grandstands and in public, and occasionally booed or whistled as the British team flashed by. At night, in the privacy of our hotel, some of the Italians came to visit us and begged us with tears in their eyes to beat the Germans, as they thought we were the only team likely to do so. Constantly, in my newspaper, I was telling British diplomats and foreign secretaries how to behave. Here, at Cortina, was a chance to put my theories into practice. But when I was confronted with an international situation in miniature, I found that my contribution was to see clearly how badly the others were behaving, to disapprove of them, to feel superior, and to hold myself aloof. There were some strange interludes in this warfare. The Italians had built a wonderful racing track at Cortina, but it finished at the finishing post. They had forgotten that the bobs raced past that point at nearly 100 miles an hour and needed at least a quarter of a mile of surfaced and uphill ice before they could pull up in safety. The result was that the most dangerous part of the race came after you had finished the course. The Germans found themselves quite unable to take the corner after the finishing post. They crashed there almost every time. By the last day of the championship, they had been reduced by injuries from 4 teams to 1. They displayed a cold courage which startled and frightened us. One German team crashed badly. 2 of the men were seriously injured and had to go to hospital. Another was cut on his thigh. The 4th, the captain, had a gash nearly 4 inches long on his cheek. As we ran forward to help, the captain picked himself up, surveyed his falling and writhing comrades, then turned his back on them and, marching to the timekeeper's hut, said in German, "What was our time, please?" The Belgians also crashed here. One of their team was injured and they had no reserve to take his place. They were doing well in the races and had one more descent to make to complete the course. That night they scoured the bars of Cortina, searching for some Belgian who would make the descent for the glory of his nation. Around midnight they found him. He was a charming, unassuming, and above all unsuspicious young man who knew nothing about bobbing. Lobsters turn from black to red very swiftly when plunged into boiling water. Humans change yet more swiftly from pink to green when plunged down an ice track on a racing bob without knowing what they are in for. How they held him on remains a mystery, but they made good time, and the young Belgian was rightly a hero of Cortina. After the first 2 days, we made a united and vehement protest to the authorities about the dangerous state of the track. They went into conference, and presently emerged with beaming smiles, saying, "Tomorrow everything will be all right." Next day, we eagerly visited the danger point before climbing the mountain to the start. The track was as it always had been. Evidently the job of reconstruction had been too heavy to undertake. But there was an addition to the amenities. An aged and lovable gentleman with long drooping moustaches had been stationed there. He had an open penknife in his hand. He explained that his job was to scrape the blood off the ice if there was a spill, so that the onlookers should not suffer from any feelings of distress. We had no reserves for our British team, so we provided ourselves with drugs in case any of us suffered injury. For, injured or not, we were resolved to get the bob down the track somehow or other. The first day of the championships we made a bad beginning. We got the worst of the draw, having to race on a badly cut-up track after the sun had risen and a slight thaw had taken the bite and speed out of the ice. The Germans led us by over a second. On the 3 following days, the situation improved. We broke the world's record for the Cortina run on each occasion, doing better every day, and finally ended ahead of the Germans. It would be idle to pretend that this triumph gave everybody satisfaction. There was a sultry atmosphere as we moved into the hotel to receive our prizes. Countess Chiano stood behind a table loaded with vast pots decorated with fascist emblems. She had hoped to hand them to the Germans. Now they had come to us. The Countess had learned one of her father's mannerisms. A friend told me she used to practice it in front of a mirror until she got it right. She was able suddenly to open her eyes so wide that a white ring showed all around the pupils. This gave her a mesmeric and demonic gaze. She now turned it full force upon us as we sat before her waiting for our prizes. A band was provided to play the national anthem. Unfortunately, owing to some misunderstanding, or more probably because our victory over the Germans had upset previous arrangements, when the words "Great Britain" were shouted and we advanced towards the Countess to collect our pots, the band broke into a loud and spirited rendering of Deutschland über alles. The Germans looked furious. We stood to attention with British phlegm, but the Countess, after giving the band a glance almost loud enough to drown their music, suddenly burst into peals of shrill laughter. Then she gave us our pots, and we took our departure. We had a happy party with the American team that evening. We talked together of the Olympic Games, which were to be held at the end of that fateful year, 1939, in Germany, at Garmisch, and at which some of us had been invited to represent our nations. Next day we went our several ways. Some blood had been shed, and some bad blood created between the World's Bobsleigh Championship at Cortina. Had been created by the World's Bobsleigh Championship at Cortina. That was the main result of it all. I returned to England with my pot. I shut it in a cupboard, where it has stayed ever since. I was out for other trophies from life, and I did not have to travel so far afield as Cortina to lay my hands upon them. Tomorrow, Chapter 5. My apologies, I can see there's a little delay on the webcam, but this is really, it's not about looking at my mug, is it? It's about listening. Webcam is kind of new, so I was messing with settings on it, so that's probably why you've got all this kind of anomaly going on. First world problems, my friends. See you tomorrow. Check me out below if you want to ding-a-ling. I'm not going to ring it until you buy me a coffee. I'm not even going to mention that for a while more because I think it's probably annoying some people, all one or two of you. Good night from Ireland. Mark saying,